How do we know we are human? Since the creation of time, humanity has questioned their humanity and even their connection to a higher power. Throughout history, many men have claimed to be gods or even prophets of God. Over the passing of time, men wanted to have connection to the gods. There were many leaders, such as the Caesars, who thought they should be worshipped as God. How would someone think that they are a prophet from God? What would a man do if he thought he was connected to a higher power? Three different men changed the way their society would view the gods and the connection to their gods. Leaders are men and women who have taken a role above and leading a group of people. One definition of a god is an image or of a supernatural being, an idol. Men such as Akhenaten, Alexander the Great, and Brigham Young have all taken the role of calling themselves gods, seen as gods or connected to a supreme god. These men were all leaders, but in different respects on how they became leaders and how they handled being a leader. Akhenaten was born Amenhotep IV, but changed his name to Akhenaten. This created a cultural and religious revolution, which made Aten, the sun god, the center of worship. There are many different theories as to why Akhenaten decided to change the entire idea of religion and god worship in Egypt. Alexander the Great was born to Philip II, who had the military and governmental system set up for Alexander the Conqueror as much as he did. Alexander III of Macedon was a god in his era. Also known as Alexander the Great, became a king of Macedon during his teenage years and got his title of the Great because of his military and political power. Military commanders today still look at Alexander's battle history to try and understand how he was able to be so successful. A man took his people to an unknown promised land. This man was named Brigham Young, and he led the people of the Mormon faith to Salt Lake City, Utah. Brigham Young became the leader of the Mormon movement after Joseph Smith's death. Joseph Smith was the founder of the Latter-day Saints movement. Smith thought that he was connected to God and even had revelations from God to write his own divine book called the Book of Mormon. Smith had a large amount of followers to understand his new teachings. Smith's death and young succession brought about a new change into that religious movement. Young wanted to escape the persecution and rules that were happening in Illinois. He would lead his people to Salt Lake City, Utah, to create a new life and a new happiness for his people. These three leaders would enact major changes that would change the worship and religion of their times. Akhenaten's culture was not monotheistic. Akhenaten's culture in Egypt relied on multiple gods for every aspect of their life. The chief god before Akhenaten's time was Amun or Amen, the sun god, and other gods were with him, including Aten, which was the sun disk. Before Akhenaten's reign and change in the religious hierarchy, there are different leaders of religion that coincided with the pharaoh. During that time, the priests of Amun had the highest religious and governmental officials, but because of a change to a monotheistic worship of Aten, it became lower and the temples of Amun were destroyed. The pharaoh would then become the sole religious and governmental leader during that time. This would change the power structure, not only in worship in Egypt, but would also change who the religious authorities were. Alexander's culture during the time focused on kings being godlike. During Alexander's time, leaders and kings such as Alexander and Philip, were viewed as being above normal men. Philip and Alexander both have been stated that they were able to trace their lineage back to Zeus, the king of Greek gods, and connected with Zeus. The kings were seen as connected to gods, but not divine, and not equal to gods. In Alexander's time, men such as Philip would want to be divine, but not until Alexander's time that a man's equality with God would be accepted and widespread, with the culture of Alexander being worshipped as a god. These three things would change the way the religion was handled because of Akhenaten uplifting Aten as a monotheistic god. Alexander would change himself into a god, or what he thought was a god, and Brigham changing the Mormon faith by moving them to Salt Lake City and changing many of their ideologies after they moved. All these men had a connection to what they saw as a deity. Akhenaten was connected to the god Aten. He had a connection because of the disruption in the religious order in Egypt. Akhenaten changed his name to connect himself to the worship of Aten, because his name now connects him to caring about Aten. Akhenaten would show his connection between man and Aten when Akhenaten himself said, "There is no other who knows you except your son Akhenaten." Akhenaten would do everything that he thought was right to make sure that Aten was worshipped correctly and over any other god. Alexander thought he had a connection with the king of the Greek gods, Zeus Ammon. Stories of before his birth and statements that Zeus Ammon had even impregnated Olympus, Alexander's mother. Alexander had a connection to that god. Alexander was further seen to be a god when he was seen by an oracle to be the son of Zeus Ammon and not of Philip's. Alexander believed that he was the son of Zeus, and showed it through the coins he printed, which showed his godly conception, and then by the worship of Zeus. Alexander's connection to Zeus Ammon would make him think that he was equal to the gods, and would begin acting in ways to show his status among men. Brigham Young would lead an exodus to a city for religious freedom. After Joseph Smith's death, the people of the Mormon faith needed a new leader. Even though Joseph Smith was the original prophet and the writer of what they thought was the sacred word of God, finding a new successor was going to be a hard task. But the apostles of the Mormon faith eventually decided on a man named Brigham Young to be the highest leader of their faith, what they called the president of the Mormon faith. Brigham Young would change the Mormon faith by leading exodus to the west, eventually leading in Utah, mainly the Salt Lake City, Utah area. They did this to escape religious persecution and be able to run their government under their control, as Brigham Young became the governor of Utah, and of all the people of the Utah were Mormon. Brigham Young thought he had a connection with the Christian God. The president of the church was the high priest, and with him were other priests. The high council of priests was called the Quorum of the 12. Young himself, in his earlier life, would become a missionary to parts of the country and even England itself. He then, after Smith's death, became president of the Quorum, and he thought he had a connection to God. Young, after Smith's death, took a leadership position and also as a leader of the expedition to Utah, with what he expressed his idea that he was following the will of God to have an exodus to Utah. Brigham Young would further become, in his mind, connected to God because of his position as a leader of the Mormon faith. Young would stay a leader until his death, and with all these things he saw himself connected to God. through both his lessons in the pulpit and his leadership in the Mormon faith. These three leaders changed their religions substantially. Akhenaten changed his religion by moving of the capital, the change of his name, and the way gods were worshipped in his religion. In Akhenaten's culture, changing names was a very large deal because of the meaning behind names. And with Akhenaten changing his name to mean of service to attend would be a major change. Another change in religion would be the movement of the capital. The capital in the past was in Thebes, the center of a moon worship, so Akhenaten moved the capital to a city called Akhenaton, which he named himself, that then became the center for worship. It was a change that was put there because the sun rose in the surrounding cliffs. With this change, it furthered the worshipping of Aten because it changed the power and capital to a place where Aten was worshipped. Akhenaten would take the place as chief priest in the worship of Aten, and the prophets of Amun lost their power. This created a new power structure where the pharaoh or king had more power than any other man did by far, because he was in charge of both the government and the religious aspect of the country. Akhenaten changed the religion to a new capital, and him as high priest in connection with the main god that he made the people worship. Alexander thought himself to be a god after his many successful victories. Alexander once asked Indian philosophers what makes a man become a god, and they replied by doing something man cannot do. Alexander became like a god not only in his ability to do military things, but also in the way that he was worshipped and dressed. Alexander dressed if he was a god and worshipped in his city. Alexander wore golden crowns and robes of purple. Alexander was worshipped as a leader and military general, but also as a hero cult. Alexander would change his elevated status to above regular rulers by adopting the idea of proskynesis. The idea of proskynesis was when someone bowed to Alexander, the person became prostrate to the floor to show the rank of someone higher than you. Some of Alexander's subjects did not like proskynesis because it was higher respect than any living man should receive. Alexander adopted this culture to take the next step to say that he believes that he is a living god and should be respected as one. Alexander brought changes during leadership that would change how Alexander is viewed and worshipped. Brigham Young would bring many changes to the Mormon faith. After moving the people of the Mormon faith to Salt Lake City, Utah, he started implementing his changes. His changes in the faith included such things as increased polygamy, the shedding of blood for the atonement of sins, and treatment of African Americans. Polygamy, the practice of multiple wives, was in effect before Brigham Young's leadership. Young allowed the practice of polygamy to grow, allowing almost all men that followed him to take multiple wives, Young himself having over 20 wives. African Americans were treated as lower than whites during Brigham Young's leadership. Young thought African Americans were the servants of servants and allowed the practice of slaveholding in Utah. His ideology of slaves not being allowed in the church would create a culture that openly disdained African Americans and calling them abominations. Young's radical stance changed how the culture reacted during the time. Young believed that a dead saint is better than a living sinner, and that only through death could salvation be found. Young's ideals of salvation through death would go throughout the Utah establishment, one woman even killing her husband because he was unfaithful and saw his murder as the only way to receive salvation. Young's people would even massacre a group of immigrants, and afterwards Young himself said it was the will of God that they be killed. Young changed the Mormon faith into a more radical group, following his sermons and teaching no matter how radical they were. Akhenaten's religious changes would make a major reform in Egypt. All the other god temples were destroyed and closed off. The people were afraid of Akhenaten, so they followed his religious change, but would probably still secretly worship other gods. The priests of the gods would go against this change because they lost their jobs and power. Akhenaten was focused on religious reform, that he did not worry about the other affairs, so he sent up regents in Thebes. Akhenaten would create a culture that was not actively endorsed by his people because of his monotheistic worship, when the people would want to stay with a polytheistic worship. Alexander conquered most of the known world during his time as king. Alexander would encounter many cultures as he conquered, and he would be accepted as king and would be started to be worshipped as a king. In his conquering of Egypt, he was given the title of the son of Ra and of Pharaoh. He was now the chief god's son in the Egyptian culture. The Egyptian priests and oracles even talked to him as the son of Zeus, and saw that he was connected to divinity and had grown as believers of his divinity. Alexander's conquest would also lead him to new followers in his god worship in Asia. Alexander would conquer the Arab people and then be worshipped as their third god. Alexander's conquest would lead him to have new followers and new men who saw him as a god in the human world. Alexander's conquered lands would show that could gain followers to have a religious following. Brigham Young would keep his culture in the way of light and not that the American government changed how things were in Utah. Young had himself set up as governor and had created a theocracy in the territory owned by the American government, and President Buchanan did not want Young to have that kind of power. Buchanan was going to send troops to Utah, but Young was willing to retaliate to keep the Mormon way of life as it was in Utah and not to have un-Mormon leaders in Utah. Young saw that the American government was trying to take control of what he created. Young was willing to face any outside attack against himself and his followers, even if it meant by force and violence. These three men would have legacies because of what they did, and would stay a part of history and the history of religion for the rest of time. Akhenaten's culture went back to polytheism. The monotheistic worship of Aten was not a lasting change of the culture of Egypt. After Akhenaten's death, the eventual change back to the capital of Thebes and a polytheistic religion went back into place. Akhenaten's religious reformation would see him as a heretic king, and that he had a differing view of the pharaohs, and after or before him, because of the change back to polytheism. Alexander would be seen as a great and military hero, but not viewed as a god. He was worshipped as a hero and had a cult following, but the idea of equal of him to Zeus would not be continued in a large effect. Alexander's sudden death and collapse of his empire would create a divided area that would find multiple leaders to look to. Alexander's military and strategic victories are seen as almost that something man cannot do, but Alexander is remembered as great, not as a god. Brigham Young set up Mormonism that grew in the country. After his death, the Mormon movement would then move about the country and spread the religion. Even though his more radical beliefs were not followed to the current age, he is still seen as one of the first and greatest leaders of the Mormon faith. These three men show how a single person can change religion in an entire culture. It's from Brigham, Akhenaten, and Alexander that we learn that religion plays such an important part in everyday life.